Well, hello. Looks like there's a bunch of people here. Let's see who. Craze Family Homestead, Will It Grow, Jules, Small Gardening, Voonchild, MB Heritage Farm, Craze Family Homes. I think I got you already. Simply Jan. Jan, welcome. F&P Farms, welcome. All of you, welcome. So I think I got everybody so far. Mother Goose, welcome to the live. So I apologize for not letting you know last week that I wasn't going to be on live. I hope it didn't disrupt too many schedules. Homestead Aquarius, hello. But we had to leave town. It was my wife's birthday. And so I went to Sanibel, Florida with her, and we enjoyed some rest and relaxation on the beach. So while I was there, Sandy got to go and look for seashells, and she got a bunch of them. She really enjoys looking for seashells and picking them up, and I like to identify them. And so we had a good time. But while she was collecting shells down by the seashore, I was listening to YouTube, and I listened to a lot of different YouTube videos, not only some of y'all's videos, got caught up on a few of them, but I also listened to a bunch of gardening videos and tutorials. And so I developed a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, I guess. Some of the videos that I watched stated some things that I know not to be true. And so I'm not going to do a debunking video or anything like that, but I want to make a couple of statements that I think are important for me because it will help you to understand why I believe what I believe about gardening and why I do some of the things that I do. I watched a bunch of no-till videos, and I think there's a place for no-till. I really do. But I also believe that there's a place for tillage. And so what I want to talk about first is why I believe what I believe. So I believe that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I believe that he created all of the things that we see on a daily basis, all of the elements, all of the landscapes that we see, the way that plants grow, all of the rules of gardening all come from the principles that he put in place in the first 6 days of creation. But the thing that I heard over and over again on a lot of the videos that I watched while I was getting a suntan on the beach was people would say things like, I want to get back to gardening, back to the way that it's naturally done, and back to the way that God intended for gardening to be done. Well, I need to point you to Genesis chapter 2, and I'm not going to read it to you. I'm not going to recite it. I'm not even going to quote it farther than I have already. But in Genesis chapter 2, it explains that something critical and something devastating took place in the garden. And that is that man, for the very first time, chose to defy God. Now that's important, and it's important for this reason. Prior to man sinning, defying God's rules, man lived in the Garden of Eden. And in the Garden of Eden, everything grew perfectly. I believe that all of the plants were watered from the bottom. I believe that there were no weeds. Genesis chapter 2 is fairly clear about that. The garden essentially grew on its own. God said to Adam and Eve, go out, pick from the garden, take whatever you want, and it's yours for food. But when they defied God, they were thrown out of the garden. And we don't live in the garden, we live outside of the garden. The way things are, we need to try to get back to the way they were in the garden, but we'll never get there. And the reason we'll never get there is because God said that once man had sinned, his punishment was that from that point forward, he would survive in the garden by the sweat of his brow. It was going to be work. It was going to be hard labor and work. So I believe that as we go forward trying to master agriculture and gardening, we're going to have to figure out now not how nature does it, because the way nature does it is flawed. And to think that we can go back to how things grow in nature, and we can go back to, and I'm not really knocking the idea of food forests. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about saying that, well, nature does it this way, and therefore we should do it the way nature does it. And the reality is we can't. And we shouldn't try to do it the way nature does it. We should do it the way God directed us to it. And that's by hard work, the sweat of our brow. And it doesn't have to be tremendously difficult. We shouldn't make it any more difficult than it has to be. But we need to understand that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be an awful lot of fun as well, because we live in a time when we don't necessarily depend upon the garden to meet all of our needs. So with that, I'll move on to what I want to talk about tonight. Tonight I'm going to talk about potassium. Potassium, as all of you are aware, is one of the macronutrients. And depending upon how you look at these things, there's 3 macronutrients or there's 5 macronutrients. Calcium and sulfur would be the 4th and 5th, but nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are going to be your top 3 micronutrients or macronutrients. And then there's about, 14 micronutrients, depending upon how you feel about nickel. So what do we need to do in our garden? We need to provide our plants with potassium. Why? Because although potassium is present in the garden and it's present in our soil in a way that you can't even measure. I mean, the amount of potassium that's in the soil is huge, but most of it is in the clay layer, and it's tied up. It's unavailable to the plants, because even if the plants reach down into the clay, the cation exchange rate of the clay with potassium is difficult. There's a poor cation exchange, and that has to do with the fact that potassium has a radical ion, which it loses when it's put into any kind of moisture. So in a moment, I'm going to talk to you about why plants need potassium, but first I want to talk just a little bit about potassium itself. And potassium is a metal. You may not be aware of that, but if you look on the elemental chart, potassium will be number 19 on the chart, and it is part of the metals, but it is an alkali metal, meaning that on the acidity rate, it is alkaline, and it's extremely alkaline. In fact, if you were to take elemental potassium, if you were to take elemental potassium and drop it in water, it would have an exothermal reaction so strong that it would begin to boil the water, and as the hydrogen boiled out of the water, it would ignite into flames. There's actually some YouTube videos on this, really cool stuff. Don't try it at home. But they took about a cube, about a ½ inch by ½ inch of potassium, and they threw it into a bucket of water, and it was a violent, instantly the water began to boil, the hydrogen escaped, it caught fire. Pretty cool. But potassium is the second softest metal known to man. And potassium is silver in color. It looks almost about the same color as mercury. In fact, if you were to melt it, now we're not going to do that. It melts at about 800 degrees, which is pretty low melting point. But if you were to melt it, it would look almost like mercury. Now, you can cut it with a knife. It's that soft. And it's extremely caustic. That's what the alkali metals are, very caustic metals. So one of the things that confused me for a while is why, if it's potassium, why is it K? Why is it NPK? Nitrogen is N, phosphorus is P. Why is potassium K? Well, potassium is K because originally, when it was discovered, the German scientists called it Kali, K-A-L-I. Kali is the root word for alkali. And so they felt that they should use the word Kali. And it was, I guess, other scientists ganged up on Germany, and we ended up calling it potassium. Potassium is literally a Latin translation, or potash is the Latin translation of potassium. So in Latin, it's potash, and the reason that they called it potash originally is because for centuries, people would burn wood for heat. They'd take the wood ash that they had burned, and they'd throw it out into the fields, into their gardens. And eventually, somehow they learned that that gray-white fleck in the wood ash was potash, or potassium, or Kali if you're German. So that's about what I know about potassium in terms of it elementary. But when we get into plant life, plants use potassium in three primary ways. Really every cell in the plant has some potassium in it, but it's necessary for root development, for shoot development, and potassium is found in the leaves of plants. On every plant leaf, on the underside of the plant leaf, you have little pores, little holes, and those are called stomata. And what the stomata do is they allow the plant to respire. So transpiration is the process that a plant uses to pull liquids or water from the soil up through the plant. So what God did when he created plants is he created these trachea, which is what the xylem flows through. They connect to the roots and they run up to the leaves. And so when the leaves sit in the sun, that water gets warm. And when water gets warm, it expands. And the stomata open up, and that expanded water is released. But because water tends to stick together in a column, you're now using that respiration, or not respiration, transpiration. The plant is giving off moisture, not steam per se, but moisture. And as that exits, it pulls more water up. And the water that it pulls up is filled with nutrients. The nutrients that are brought to it by the mycorrhizae, the nutrients that the roots themselves pull in, and there's also bacteria that brings nutrients to the plants. And so this is the process by which the minerals and the nutrients are drawn up into the plant. But none of that would be possible without phosphorus, or without potassium, because potassium plays two key roles in this process. The first key role is that potassium is part of what binds the minerals into the liquid, so that the minerals, which are heavy, some of them, are drawn up with the water. Otherwise, they would just fall out of solution. But the potassium helps with that process. Now, it does the same thing in the human body, in your bloodstream. It keeps minerals and nutrients in a liquid solution, bound in with the hemoglobin, I suppose, and it brings it to the different parts of your body. That's why when you get cramps in your legs, you say, well, I'm going to go eat a banana. I need more potassium. So plants need the potassium for the same reason, to aid in the movement of nutrients through the plants, through the tracheum, my mind is losing the words. So anyway, let's move on. The other place that the plants need potassium, and this is maybe the most important area. Remember those stomata that I talked about, the pores in the bottoms of the leaf? On each side of those pores, there is a guard cell. So there's 2 guard cells per stomata. And those guard cells use potassium as their reactive chemical. So they open and close based on the plant's need. So when the plant has excessive moisture that it needs to release, the stomata open up and that moisture comes out, bringing more nutrients up through the plant. When the plant senses bacteria and bad stuff on the outside, the stomata close. Now, carbon dioxide also comes in through the stomata, and the carbon dioxide and the water and all of the other elements that have been brought up by the water, they're held in the leaf where there is photosynthesis taking place. Now, the leaf is made up of a waxy surface on the top and somewhat on the bottom of the leaf. And then there's a cuticle, which is parenchyma cells that have come close together, small parenchyma cells that have come together to form a hard cuticle on the top of the leaf. That's the epidermis of the leaf. Under that epidermal layer, you've got the palisades layer, and then underneath that, you've got the spongy layer, and those are all made up of parenchyma cells. I don't really want to get into photosynthesis, but each one of those parenchyma cells has potassium. Potassium is also found in the collenchyma cells, which make up the shoots of the plant, or at least they're the new growth of the shoots are made up of parenchyma cells, and the parenchyma cells are longer cells. The collenchyma cells are longer cells than the parenchyma cells, and the potassium is what helps those collenchyma cells to have flexibility. So we talked a little bit not last week, but the week before last, we talked about tropism in plants. Now, one of the types of tropism is plants will aim towards the sun. So sunflowers, for example, are heliotrophic, meaning that they follow the sunrise, and then they come back at night and they pick up the sunrise again. And it's the potassium stretching and contracting in the parenchyma cells. At least that's part of how those plants get their flexibility. Now, one of the problems that we have in our garden, and particularly when we're starting plants, is that we get very leggy plants, especially if you don't get bright light directly on those plants very quickly. Xylem is the word I was looking for. Thank you, Jacob's allotment. The xylem is what brings the nutrients up. The phloem brings the nutrients back down, and in fact, nutrients move both ways in the phloem. And someday maybe we'll get into how all of the phloem works. But the xylem is that transpiration process. So leggy plants are caused not really, well, what really causes plants to get leggy? So it's because there's not enough light directly above them. There's not intense enough light. But really what's happening is, let's go back to God's principle, what God created in those plants. In the cotyledons of the plant, when the cotyledons begin to leave the seed, when they break that seed coat and they leave the seed, the cotyledons break through the soil and they're looking for light. God created something in those cotyledons. And this is something that even plant scientists don't really completely get. They call it geotropism, and that's the ability of a plant to move in a certain direction. Roots, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, roots will move downward as the radical breaks through that seed. It's going to move downward because of the weight of certain elements of the cells. It's going to move downward. And, you know, the stem maybe just moves opposite of the roots, but once it breaks through, it gets to the light, a major change takes place. So the cotyledons, their job is to break through the ground. They're filled with the nutrients for the plants, the endosperm. They break through, and once they see the light, they signal the shoot to stop growing. And actually, that shoot then becomes the root. So from the seed going down, the radical creates roots, and the stem from that seed going up, from those roots going up to the cotyledons, that's the first part of the shoot. There's a lot of things going on there with meristem cells, but we'll get into that in another time. So when those cotyledons see the light, they signal the plant to stop growing. So if you put your light very close and the cotyledons break through and they open up, you won't get leggy plants if they get that light right away. So 3 or 4 days after the cotyledons have all broken through, if you raise that light 14 inches up, those plants aren't going to get leggy. Now, they might not get enough light and other things can happen, but they won't get leggy after that. So that's the principle. That's the science that's going on, is the seed has the information in the cotyledon, that portion of the embryo. Once it sees the light, it ceases growth above the ground and below the cotyledon. Well, it ceases vertical growth. There is going to be horizontal growth where the cells begin to thicken and move outward, and then you've got a whole bunch of things going on that I'm not going to get into. But you don't need to worry about the light nearly as much once those cotyledons have seen the light. This is why your house plants, if you don't have direct sun in your house plants, they'll still live. They'll do okay, and they won't get leggy, but they'll stop. They won't get leggy because the cotyledons have already seen the light and signaled the plant to stop growing below the cotyledons. Then above the cotyledons, the plumule will begin to grow, and the first set of true leaves will come out. Now, one of the things I learned a couple of weeks ago as I was preparing to do these lives, one of the things that I came across was that the true leaves are part of the embryo. I didn't realize that. I thought that they grew out later, but when the cotyledons come up, the meristem will grow up above the cotyledons, and that's actually the plumule coming up, and then those leaves will unfold from there. Now, they're very small and they grow out, but they're there in full. So that's my little thing on leggy plants. How can you tell if you have too much potassium? Well, you're not going to have too much potassium. Your plant will really only take up the potassium it needs. You may have too much potassium in the soil, so the answer to that question is get a soil test. The problem is you need to have a Bray soil test, not just a standard soil test. A simple soil test is going to tell you what your nitrogen, your potassium, your phosphorus, probably your calcium and sulfur. It may even go on to tell you that you've got a certain amount of manganese, magnesium, so forth. But and it'll tell you your pH, and that's probably the most important thing you can get from a soil test anyway. But it's not going to give you your cation exchange rate. And you need to know your cation exchange rate because you need to know how much of your potassium is available to the plant and how much of the potassium is tied up in the soil. Now, if you've got a heavy clay soil, almost all of your potassium is tied up in the soil. And the way to release that is to get your microbiology moving in the soil. For me, my plants will never reach the clay. Nothing that I plant in my garden, except maybe my asparagus, but nothing else that I have in the garden is ever going to reach the clay layer because I've got almost 24 inches of organic black matter, black dirt that my plants can grow in. And so they're never going to reach the clay layer. And if they do, they won't even try to penetrate it. But if you're living down by Craps for Life down there in Bama, you've got clay. And that red clay is going to be very difficult for the roots to penetrate. It's going to be full of potassium, but it's unavailable potassium. So you need that biological life going. You need the mycorrhizae, but you also need bacteria to release some of that. Now, that's for another day. But when we think about the available potassium in agriculture, we've done soil tests, Bray soil tests. And in agriculture, we've found that 80% of the potassium, 80% of the soil-borne potassium is unavailable to the plants. So to make it available, we need to get good biology going in that soil. And that's one thing that a lot of your big ag can't afford to do yet. So trying to think if there's anything else that I left out. So how do we add potassium? How do you know if you don't have enough potassium? Well, if you look at a leaf and pretend that my hand is the leaf and my fingers are the veins of the leaf, and then the area in between it, that's the palisade area. And so if the leaf is yellow around the edge and yellow in the between spaces, between the veins, then you probably have some kind of nutrient deficiency. May not be potassium, could be calcium, could be phosphorus, probably not calcium. Calcium would show up more in the fruit. But if you've got one or two leaves that are yellowed like that, I wouldn't worry about it. You might have, at some point, something might have crushed the xylem. So one or two leaves, maybe you've got a petiole that's twisted or something and it's not allowing. But if the entire plant has some yellowness to it, the first thing you should do is get it water. Because one of the things that unlocks some of the potassium, some of the phosphorus, certainly the nitrogen, one of the things that unlocks that is water, because all of these things are water soluble. So that kind of brings me to another point, and that is fertilizers. So this could get into some crazy back and forth conversation's great, but we keep it nice. And don't unsubscribe from me because you disagree with my practices. But when we look at commercial fertilizers, or we look at certified organic fertilizers, there are some differences. But none of those differences have anything to do with the health of the plant or the health of the people who eat from that plant. We're not talking about insecticides here or any of the pesticides. We're talking about fertilizers. And one of the things that drove me crazy, there's a guy on the internet, and I'm not going to give you his name, but he talks about how bad it is to feed your plants synthetic, air quotes, fertilizers. Well, here's the thing. Potassium is an element. It's number 19 on the elemental chart. It doesn't get on the elemental chart if it can be synthesized. Synthesized means that we made it with mixing chemicals. So potassium is elemental. Phosphorus is elemental. Nitrogen is an element. They are the macronutrients, but each one of them is an element. So although there are many ways to present phosphorus to our plants, many ways to present potassium to our plants, many ways to present nitrogen to our plants, the plant receives nitrogen as nitrogen. Potassium is potassium. Phosphorus is phosphorus. The plant doesn't say organic, non-organic. The fruit grown on that plant receives potassium. Now, we extract, I'm going to use that word so that it's not confusing, we extract potassium from the ground. But we can also get it through potash. What is potash? Again, potash is growing material. Any material that was growing has a certain amount of potassium in it. Burn that wood, burn that grass, leaves, whatever, and that white powdery dust that's left behind is potash. And the potash has a percentage of potassium in it. Spread that potash on the soil, and you're going to present potassium to your plants. The difference between that potassium And the potassium that you're going to get in a bag of triple 10, triple 14, I use a lot of triple 14 because it doesn't take as much room to store. I don't have to put as much of it down. It's more cost effective to me. We buy it a pallet at a time. Pallet will last us 5 or 6 years. But we put it down. I spoon feed my plants, and I'll get into that when we get into the summertime. But the idea behind using a commercial fertilizer is that even the slow release commercial fertilizers, you know exactly how much potassium you're getting. If it's 10, 10, 10 in a 20-pound bag, you're getting 10% of that 20-pound bag is potassium. 10% of it's phosphorus. 10% of it is nitrogen. So you can do the math. You can say with 20 pounds, so it's about 2 pounds. I think I'm doing that right. About 2 pounds of well, you do the math. I think I've got this backed up in my head, and when I'm not live, I'll figure it out. But you can figure out exactly how much potassium you're putting on the ground. On the other hand, when you use an organic product like horse manure is actually very high in potassium. I don't remember what the numbers are. I didn't think to look them up. Cow manure is going to be a little less high in potassium than horse manure, but it's still going to have potassium in it. And it somewhat depends on whether or not it's grass-fed, beef. But horses will have high potassium. Chickens are going to have a high level of calcium as well as a high level of potassium in their manure. But it takes a long time for that potassium to be unlocked from the horse manure. So the availability of that horse manure, it'll take a long time. Thank you, Will It Grow, 1.5 pounds. So it'll take a long time for that potassium to be available. And generally speaking, we should be thinking ahead. We should be fertilizing this year for next year's growth. And so at the end of this year, I spread a bunch of horse manure. I think we figured it out. It was about 26 tons of horse manure. And I don't have a big field. It's just horse manure weighs a lot. And of course, you really don't know how much potassium, unless I send it out to be tested. I really don't know what amount of potassium I'm really putting down. The good news is I can't put down too much potassium. And potassium doesn't have the negative effects on nature like phosphorus would or nitrogen. You want to be very careful how much nitrogen you put on a field, because nitrogen will wash down into the soil. It does not get tied up in the clay level like potassium and phosphorus. Well, both of them will get tied up in the clay level, but the nitrogen will wash out. And one of the things I learned this past week when I was down in Florida on vacation, when the nitrogen hits the ocean, it creates algae, lots and lots of algae. And algae in the ocean is not necessarily a good thing. I wanted to do a little skin diving, a little scuba diving, or I'm sorry, not scuba, skin diving. And I brought down my mask and my snorkel and my fins. And, well, the water was way too cold to get into anyway. But I decided not to even really try to get into the water because the algae was so thick you couldn't see through it. And you could smell the algae. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the algae was so thick that it suffocated a lot of sea life. And there was huge numbers of pen shells and sea urchins and quite a few dead fish up on the beaches. We've never seen it like that before. And it was because it was because the algae just suffocated those fish out. So my potassium uh, my potassium recommendations are this. I fertilize with a balanced fertilizer. And the only, John, you are a sick man. Nobody wants to see that. I like to use a balanced fertilizer. I put organic matter on the soil in the fall. I don't put organic matter on the soil in the spring. And there's many reasons for that. But this winter that we're having right now, we probably got a freeze. I don't think we probably have 50 inches of frost. That's the deepest frost we normally get. But I bet you we've got about a 30 to 40 inch deep frost. What saved us a little bit this year is we've got about a foot of snow on the fields. And I've never, in the whole time I've lived out here, I don't remember ever seeing snow actually sticking out in the fields. But we've got probably a foot out in the field. Our snowbanks are about 4 feet tall along the roads. In fact, I've seen loader trucks out there trying to push the snowbanks back because if we have more snow, they need a place to put it. So my recommendations for potassium fertilizer is that before you plant, I would put down a balanced fertilizer, 10-10-10, 14-14-14, 12-12-12, doesn't matter, 5-5-5. I mean, if you want to pay for it, it's the lower the concentrations, the more it's going to be because you're paying for the bagging, the boxing, the shipping, and all of that. But if you put down a balanced fertilizer at the beginning of planting season, and I think I do, I'm trying to remember, my recommendations for this year were 50 pounds per acre, but I don't do that all at once. So, probably going to try to put down about 15 pounds per acre per application, and that'll take me a little bit short of that 50 pounds. But I do it by spreading it. I just side dress. So there's a lot of math involved to figure out per square foot what I need to put down because they give the recommendations by acre. So you got to take, it's really hard math. You take 56,000 and divide by that. So that's what we're going to come out with. Now, the way I do it is I side dress about 6 inches away, and I recommend you side dress both sides of your plants. Now, when you initially plant, you can put it down before you plant. You can put it right where you're going to plant, incorporate that into the soil. It's not going to hurt the plants to be touching the fertilizer. It might burn a root here or there, but it's not going to really cause a problem. You're not putting that much down, and it's the nitrogen that might cause it to burn, and because you're not using organic nitrogen, you're using a elemental nitrogen, sort of. It's not going to cause that kind of a problem. Now, it has to be water soluble. All of your fertilizers are going to have to be water soluble, and that's the problem, is that organic fertilizers take time to be water soluble. Okay, so if you put down in 100 feet of row, if you put down, let's say, 4 cups of balanced fertilizer, 10-10-10, let's say, and you do 2 cups on one side and 2 cups on the other, and you do that 3 times throughout the season and break it down so that you can get it all done in about 3/4 of the growing season, and then you'll be good to go. There are 2 exceptions to that. One is you don't want to put any fertilizer at all whatsoever on sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes, I know, well, here again, I'm talking about in my soil, and my soil's got plenty of nutrient for sweet potatoes. If I put any nitrogen on my sweet potatoes, I'll get beautiful vines, but no potatoes. On the other hand, onions. Onions are very specific. The first half of an onion growing season is its foliage phase or green phase. And some people call it the investment phase. So now you're going to put down nitrogen. You want that green growth. But at the halfway mark, about 5 days before the longest day, now this gets into how I plant onions, and I'll get into that another time. But I count back from my longest day of summer, I count back 50 days, and that's when I plant my onions. And then on my longest day, about 5 days before that, I stop with the nitrogen because the plant no longer needs nitrogen. And so what's going to happen after that longest day, the plant is going to, it's going to need phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium. And at the end of the day, that's going to create the largest bulbs. Every one of those green leaves that comes up, every one of those stems, leaves, represents one layer of the onion. And so, I think it's 15 is a perfect onion. I might be wrong on that, but I think 15 is a perfect onion. And the size of the onion is not necessarily based on that. The size of the onion is based on the onion's genetics. But the potassium and the phosphorus will cause that onion to bulb up. 14. Thank you, John. It'll cause that onion to bulb up, and the sulfur will give it the pungent taste. Now, I'm told, I didn't know this, but I'm told you shouldn't put sulfur on sweet onions. Kind of makes sense because sulfur would help to preserve the onion, and maybe that's why sweet onions don't preserve as well. But if you put sulfur on onions, you're going to get a hotter tasting onion, more pungent tasting onion. So we got a few minutes left here. Let me talk a little bit about onions. Jacko's comment here has me sort of thinking. He says, I get 7 million and the ruddy onions would still look stupid and small. You're probably talking about walking onions. They're pretty small. But when you plant onions, if you plant them by seed or by transplant, you'll get larger onions. If you plant them by sets, you're going to get small onions. In fact, onion sets, we buy oversized onion sets. Usually we buy about 3,000 oversized onion sets. And those are for green onions. There is a particular type of oversized onion, and I can't think of what it's called. I think it begins with an R, but I can't remember the name of it. So if you plant onion sets, you're going to get small onions. Nothing wrong with them. They're delicious. They sell okay, but I'd really like to have bigger onions. Wyden Family Farms is saying, Craig something. Yeah, what is it? It's Alicia Craig onion? I think it's Alicia Craig. Elisa Craig, yeah. That's a huge onion. Those are your blooming onions. They're, I don't know, 8 inches, maybe 7, 8 inches across. So,
are they a sweet onion?
The Alicia Craig onion is a sweet onion. Yes. In fact, if you grow Alicia Craig onions, you should plant them successively because they'll only keep about 3 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks. Now they'll keep in the ground better than they'll keep like in on the counter. And you don't really need to put them in the refrigerator, but Jan says she planted Parma onions. I've actually never heard of Parma onions, but that doesn't surprise me because Walla Walla is the best storing sweet onion that I know of. It's not an extremely sweet onion, but it is I think we had our Walla Wallas. I still have Walla Wallas, but they've all sprouted. And so I'm just probably going to plant those, I think. Although I've been told when you plant sprouted onions, they don't work the same, but I don't know. Jan, I recommend Walla Wallas, and it's a good size onion. It's about the size of they get to be about baseball size, little bigger maybe if you put plenty of nitrogen on them in the beginning and then hit them with. Now, when I say put nitrogen, for the first 50 days, I'm using a balanced fertilizer or a complete fertilizer. So maybe it's worthwhile explaining that for a second. When we say balanced fertilizer, we're saying that it's got the equal amounts of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, or nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, I should say. When we say that's a balanced fertilizer, it's also what we mean by complete. But then you can get things like trifecta that I believe trifecta is 10-10-10, and then it's got all the micronutrients with it. So I'm not real familiar with trifecta. I've just heard people talk about it. So yeah, they grow Vidalia onions or Vidalia onions. I've been corrected on that, and by two different people, two different ways. So it's either Vidalia or Vidalia. And but you can only grow Vidalia onions in Vidalia, Georgia. If you grow them anywhere else, it's a Texas wonder. And that's law. So, Willick Rowe makes a point. Walla Walla is not for everyone. So there are 3 different growing regions for onions. And not all alums fall into this. It's just onions. So you have short day onions, you have intermediate onions, and you have long day onions. So your long day onions, well, Walla Walla is a long day onion. And what's it based on? Well, when you get further north, we have less sun per year, but more sun in the summer. Not more intense sun, but longer sunlight, longer days of sunlight. And the thing that triggers a plant, a long day onion, the thing that triggers a long day onion to bulb is when the days begin to get shorter. Now, I don't think this can be true with short day onions because you don't plant them that way. So I think you're just looking at a 100-day growing period. But for us in the north, and by north, I don't think, I haven't looked at it for a while, so I don't remember exactly, but I think even parts of Tennessee are in the intermediate, but some of them might still be in the long day. I'm not 100% sure. So the long day onions grow better up north. And short day onions, all the way down to about the beginning of Texas. Texas has both long and short day, or not long and short day, intermediate and long and short day onions. But the intermediates, they go almost to the end of the United States. And then the short day onions there's only a few places like Texas and maybe Florida. But once you get into Mexico and down below that, then it's going to be short day onions. And it has to do with the length of sun has to do with the growth, the way that God designed the plants to grow. So with most long day onions are about 100 day. Some of them are 90, some of them are 110. I just call them all 100 day onions. And so I look at my longest day and I try to get as close to 50 days ahead of that. So I think the longest day is somewhere in June, early June. And so I plant as early as I can to get it about 50 days, and then cut off the nitrogen about 5 days before that, and then really try to hit it hard with phosphorus and potassium.
I have a question about onions from Dixon Farms.
Dixondale Farms. Who asked that question?
Primal Cajuns.
Okay, Primal Cajun mentioned Dixondale Farms.
Candy onions.
So, yeah, you cannot grow candy onions here. You can grow candy onions. That's an intermediate day onion, I believe. And Dixondale, Texas provides about 90% of the onion transplants sold in the United States. And that includes onion transplants that are sold to commercial gardeners. If you want to learn about onions, go on to dixondale.com. I believe that's what it is. It might, but Dixondale, just look up Dixondale. And if you want to learn about onions, they've got some good videos about growing onions, planting onions. My neighbor at the end of the block told me about Dixondale onions, and he tells me he dated the owner's daughter. I don't know if that's true or not because we're pretty far from Texas, but can't believe he would lie to me. So if you call down there, tell him Chicken Johnny sent you. He won't know who I am, but he'll get a good laugh out of the name. Is there anybody here who does hydroponics? Robert, Bob, are you still here? I'm just wondering if anybody's ever tried to grow hydroponic or grow onions hydroponically. Yeah. So if you're going to plant your onions by seed and you live in a long day zone or you live up north, it's time to get those planted.
Cajun says they do. They do.
Oh, you do? Is there anything in growing onions hydroponically? Hi, Gail. Is there anything in growing onions hydroponically that would be different? I mean, do you change your nutrient schedule once the bulbing stage begins and that kind of thing? Oh, Hadrian, yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that, but Cajun Hydroponics was talking about growing garlic. And really, if you can grow garlic, you can grow onions. Of course, there's a lot of ways to grow hydroponically too, besides just growing them in the PVC pipes or in the neti pots. We can't do hydroponics here. We could, but hydroponics would be really inconvenient here. By the time you got everything set up and going, it would take you forever to winterize everything, get it all taken down, cleaned up. Maybe it's not that hard. Maybe someday I'll do it. But I only know of a couple places that do it here, and they have buildings where they go year round. And I don't know how they can make enough to make that work. Hey, before I'm done here, a couple of little, I don't know if they're shout outs, but if you haven't seen Will It Grow's video on growing microgreens, write it down on a piece of paper, get over there, watch his video. After I watched his video on microgreens, I started a tray of microgreens down in my grow room. I've got 2 more days and I'll pull my cover off and see if I've sprouted. And Bob from Craps for Life, I talked to him earlier about hydroponic or about microgreens as well. So good stuff. And you're welcome, John. And the other one, you've heard me talk about Steve Toonstra, and normally he's on the feed. I was hoping he'd be on the live today. He put up a video, I think a week ago, about how he planned his garden, and he did it on a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet. And I'll tell you, I've watched a lot of people talk about their garden plan, but Steve does a really good job of breaking it down. So if you have a interest in that or a chance to do it, it's Steve Toonstra in the Garden, I believe is his name. So so Primal Cajun, you're saying you're going to start a tray of microgreens for the chickens. That's really not a bad idea. I think I'll do that as well.
Jan does microgreens.
Thank you, Craze Family Homestead. I appreciate that. So I'm going to grow microgreens. Yeah, Steve Toonstra's channel is up there too. Really, I would encourage you to go over and watch that video. I think he just does a really good job of how he lays everything out. I wish I was that organized and that able. Yeah, Jan, we feed our chickens like the protective leaves off of the cabbage, and they love that. So I think I started a tray. I believe it's cabbage. It might be pak choi. I had a bunch of bags of seeds that the names were off, and I cannot tell the difference between broccoli and cabbage and pak choi and kohlrabi, just by looking at the seeds. So I put some down. I'm going to let it grow, and then I'll know. I can tell not by the cotyledons, but if I let a couple of them go to the first leaves, I can tell by the first leaves what they are. But so, one of the things that makes microgreens really healthy, and I found this out today, is it's just the cotyledons. You're trimming and eating those cotyledons, and the plant nutrient is in those cotyledons. So a lot of nutrition in those cotyledons.
How long will they last? Ask them.
So how long, once you've cut your microgreens, now I assume you bag them up and put them in the refrigerator. And how do you like to use them? I mean, other than feeding them to the chickens, how do you like to use them?
John says.
2 weeks. Yeah, okay. So that's actually a product we're going to bring to market. We're going to try bringing it to market. So I have to figure out how to use them so I can make it work. I did see on a video that I watched, after watching John's video, I started my microgreens, and then I sat in front of YouTube and I watched a couple other videos to see what to do with them. And I wasn't really happy with a lot of the answers, but one person, and I think it was the Fit Farmer, maybe, she dehydrated the microgreens and then she put them in a ball jar, and she said you can take them out later and put them in soups, and you can crush them up and put them as a seasoning on a salad or a steak or something like that. So I suppose you're almost using them as a seasoning at that point. So alfalfa. So Wyden Family Homes, here's what I know about alfalfa, and it's very little. Alfalfa does not like wet land. I have some wet areas of my property, and I planted almost 3 acres of alfalfa after I first moved out here, just as a green manure, so that I could till it back into the soil and build my soil profile. And I found that very little alfalfa made it in the areas where the land was kind of wet. Yeah, we feed, Gail, we feed our chickens kale as well. The other thing is when you plant alfalfa, you should always you plant a protective crop. It's also called a cover crop, but that's confusing. And so we plant alfalfa and then we'll plant oats over the top of it, so that alfalfa is perennial, but the oats would only be annual, and the oats will give protection to the alfalfa the first year. Otherwise, not only will your chickens love alfalfa, but every bird that flies overhead is going to love to eat your alfalfa. The deer are going to come in and eat those little sprouts, and every other kind of vegetarian vermin will come in and have a feast, and they just won't grow. So you need to plant something. Now you could I think oats is what everybody uses around here when they're putting in alfalfa fields, or they'll plant alfalfa in with timothy grass, or they'll plant it in with brome grass, because that's what they eventually want, is they want a field of timothy and brome. Alfalfa doesn't come up real well the first year. Actually, I've had problems anytime I've tried to grow alfalfa. So
Homestead Aquarius has a
yeah, so Homestead Aquarius is saying it wouldn't be very easy in aquaponics would be very difficult because you don't really have tremendous control. I did try, I used to have several fish tanks, and we had a 100-gallon tank up here in the living room and a 55 in the living room, and I had 120-gallon and a couple of 55s in the basement, and they were all centrally filtered. And then I used that to I used aquaponics as a way of filtering the water so that it would take the nitrates out of the water and leave the nitrites, or maybe I've got that backwards. All right, so Mama Goose has just made me aware that the brownies are coming out of the oven. You don't get this unfit physically by passing up on brownies. So I got a cup of, this is milk, but I've got some Chase and Sanborn coffee. That's some great tasting coffee. You know why Chase and Sanborn coffee tastes so good, don't you? Because what Chase didn't know about coffee, Sanborn did. So Homestead Aquarius, thank you. He just posted. I'm going to hit that link when I go off here. So we've got 18 people in the room, 18 thumbs up, and so I give you 18 thank yous. My last video did pretty well, and I appreciate the support that I get from all of you. I just want to, thank you. I just want to, Let's see, here it is. Nice brownie.
For John.
That's for you, John. Oh, and John, that's for you too. So I hope you found this hour of your time worthwhile, worth repeating. I'll be back. Well, there's a few more here, Voon. If you want to come over, I'm sure we can get you one. I hope you found this hour informative. If you did, if you're not subscribed, I think everybody here is subscribed, but if you're not, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. Lori, welcome. If you haven't hit the thumbs up, well, everybody's hit the thumbs up, so thank you for that. I'll be back next week, Thursday night, 7 o'clock, and we're probably going to talk about another element in the garden. Not sure which one right now, but I've got a video coming out. Hopefully it'll be edited and out by Sunday, if not by Monday. And my plan is I'm going to build a planting bench. So a bench to put down in my planting room. Right now I'm working off of a table and it's kind of awkward. So I'm going to build a planting bench. Well, John, if you're going to talk nasty about the chicken, then we're going to go out with the chicken. Y'all have a great night. Thanks for coming by. Good night. That's how you choke a chicken. Sandy knows. Good night, everybody.